And I would like to introduce Professor Williams, who is the Associate Professor of Chemistry at Pitzer, and she has been with the college since 2003. She has a PhD from the University of Washington and did her postdoc at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Oh, and there is Brenda. You're muted. Okay.
I'm sorry. I got bumped out and now I'm discombobulated. So perhaps we should start. I'll say to everyone that's joined us, first of all, thank you for joining this session. And if you'd like to put in the chat where you're logging in from, and if you'd like to share what year your student is and anything else about yourself that you'd like, please do. And then Professor Williams might speak to this too, but if you have questions, you can put them in the chat. Perhaps questions can be answered along the way, but I'll leave that up to Professor Williams. I'm Brenda Bollinger. I'm on the Pitzer College Advancement staff. I'm the Director of Foundation and Corporate Relations. And we're so glad that you're participating in Family Weekend and hope you've enjoyed a number of sessions so far with more to go. So it's my privilege today to introduce Professor Nancy Williams, our speaker today. So I'll tell you a little bit about her and then I'll turn over the Zoom mic. So Professor Williams is an associate professor of chemistry in the Keck Science Department, which is the joint sciences program of Pitzer College, Scripps College, and Claremont McKenna College. Professor Williams has been with Keck Science since 2003. She has a PhD from the University of Washington and was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her undergraduate studies were done right here, or at least where I am, in Claremont at Harvey Mudd College. Some of the courses she's taught include general chemistry, organic chemistry, inorganic synthesis, and advanced laboratory in chemistry. In this session, Professor Williams will speak on trans and non-binary rights under Biden, what to expect, and what we can fight for. So please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Nancy Williams. And just a quick word for those of you who joined us in the middle of that, if you want to put in the chat where you're logging in from, we'd love to know. Okay, thank you so much.
Well, hello, and thank you very much for that kind introduction. I thought quite a bit about what I wanted to talk about during this talk, and I have to say my original plan has been caught a little bit off guard by just how quickly so much has happened already in the first few weeks of the Biden administration. I expected much of this to happen quickly, but I didn't expect quite so much of it to happen by February 13th. And so I thought what would be most helpful might be to give a little bit more of an historical perspective on how we got to where we are on trans and non-binary rights, in particular trans rights, because non-binary rights have really only taken off as something happening at the national level in the last few years. It's been a source of a lot of activism at the state and local level long before that. But to just talk about how we got to the moment we're at and where we might be able to go a little bit. And I'm going to do this particularly from my own perspective as a trans person who lived some of this history. So some of this history may be quite familiar to you, but might come through a different lens. And I also wanted to make this on the shorter side so that we could have more time for a little bit of back and forth and Q&A and conversation, because I thought that would be more helpful than simply making a whole bunch of predictions when I've learned that crystal balls are not very valuable in this day and age. A lot of what we predict turns out to be wrong, but I have some educated guesses on where we might go. So without further ado, let me go ahead and try to share my screen here. And after almost a year of doing all of my teaching over Zoom, I still want to check to make sure that you're seeing the PowerPoint in the format that you're supposed to see it and not the weird presenter mode. I'm getting thumbs up. I'm hoping that means everything is good. You can go ahead and stop me at any time. I will be completely honest with you. I do not lecture in this way with my students. When I'm teaching with students, I'm working in small groups. We're working on sheets where I've given them problems to talk through and to think about, or when I'm teaching a first-year seminar, I'm giving them questions to discuss or debate or to put down their thoughts on, and I'm moving into small rooms of 4 students. So I'm not used to monitoring a chat for questions. So if you have a question, just go ahead and unmute and ask. If it feels like it's timely to the slide, I'm happy to have you stop my flow. There's absolutely no reason we can't do that. Or if you feel like it's a more vague and general question, then go ahead and wait till the end when we can have a conversation. So anyway, that's me. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of terminology, I'm going to use the term trans a lot, which is a shortening of transgender. It really indicates either someone whose gender identity is different from how they were assigned at birth. I was assigned male at birth. I'm a woman, so I'm a trans woman. Trans has become a fairly universal way of saying that. Very rarely do you hear people in the community say the full word transgender, and so I'm going to make that shortening without further explanation. It can also be used to just describe anyone who identifies as transgender. The first one is maybe a useful descriptor of an entire community so that people can understand who it is that we're talking about. But not everybody who fits that technical definition might identify that way. For example, the Hijra people of India, some do identify as transgender and some do not. Some non-binary people, which is the next term I wanted, that's not the next term I wanted to define. It's the term after the next one I wanted to define. Some non-binary people who identify outside the binary of male and female also identify as transgender, and some do not, even though they all might fall under the umbrella of that first definition. And so I want to be clear that I'm not trying to assign this category to somebody who doesn't want it or who doesn't identify that way. But when we talk about the trans population or things that are being directed against trans people, it very much does include non-binary people and identities that do not fit our traditional American way of thinking about the trans community. Or at least the white way of thinking about the trans community. There are a lot of other traditions that fit under that umbrella that don't necessarily use the same terminology. Cis in chemistry is the opposite of trans. I'm proud that chemistry has provided this piece of lexicon or of wordage to our lexicon. Actually, we got it from the ancient Romans. Cis means on the same side, just like trans means on the opposite side. So a cisgender person is someone whose gender they were assigned at birth matches who they are. Okay. So what I mostly want to do is look at the ghosts of trans present and ghosts of trans pasts as a way of trying to figure out a little bit of trans yet to come. Because I think that's really the only tool we have. And I think having been in this space for a while, the way that people think about moving forward is very much affected by what we've experienced in our recent past, the strategies that have been effective, the ways in which we've been burned, and the painful fights that we've had within the community. And so I just want to sketch this over the last 30 years. And I guess because I put presidents in the title, I've sort of organized this around presidential administrations, and I've been thinking about this primarily at the federal level, but you could just as easily talk about state and local efforts as well. And I kind of want to do this through a little bit more of a trans lens than the history is normally told. And the reason that I've actually begun with the Clinton administration is that I think that is really the moment where LGBTQ plus rights really became salient on a presidential level. I think the queer and trans community attempted to engage the Reagan and Bush administrations, particularly around HIV and AIDS, for the presidency to become deeply involved in the needs of the trans and non-binary and queer communities. But ultimately we were unsuccessful in pressuring those administrations to become involved. And so it's really with Clinton and his election and his campaign promise to make sure that gay people can serve in the military, that this really hits the presidential level. He was the first president to visit the AIDS quilt and so on. And it's really, his presidency is really a transitional period for the queer and trans community, because this is the period when the cocktail became available to treat HIV, which was really a sea change in the way that the queer and trans community interacted with our government in trying to advocate for AIDS. The George W. Bush administration, I'm going to talk a bit more about how same-sex marriage really became a wedge issue under that administration. And this idea of a wedge issue, of taking a group of people or an issue that has a social valence and using that as a way of driving people to support your party, of driving people to the polls, really began to affect the trans community in the 2016 and the 2020 election. The Obama administration, I'm actually going to spend the most time on, in particular, the second Obama administration, because I think that is really the point at which trans activism really became significant on a national scale, and where a lot of the changes that created the world we live in happened on a federal level. I'm going to spend remarkably little time on the Trump administration, which may be surprising to some of you, but I'm going to argue that actually almost all of what Trump did during his 4 years was go through things that happened during the Obama administration and tried to undo them by executive order. And Biden has attempted to reverse, or has reversed, the majority of these and has the intent to reverse the rest of them in the weeks to come. And so I think we really are in many ways in a world that the second Obama administration created, even though there has been a 4-year gap that was very, very hard for the trans community in between. So as we try to understand the Biden administration, I think we can learn a lot more from the second Obama administration than the Trump administration, although there are some important things that happened that I want to talk about. The piece of legislation that really lies at the center of LGBTQ plus rights that we have been trying to pass in one form or another since the 1970s is known variously as ENDA, or the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, or the Equality Act. I'm just going to be honest, I don't think it's going to pass during the Obama or during the Biden administration. I would love to predict that it would, but with 50 Democratic senators and with only 4 votes that I can count on the Republican side, I can't see this making it into law. But I think it's worth thinking about the history of this law and what recent Supreme Court decisions have not done that this law would do, because it's a way of thinking about a little bit the relationship between the trans community and the rest of the LGBTQ plus community and how we got to where we are. And Biden has said that he's going to make this a priority in his first 100 days. He's sent people out to float as a trial balloon that he probably won't get to this during the first 100 days. I do think they will put it up for a vote. I do think it will pass the House. I think it will fail to receive cloture or to pass the filibuster in the Senate. ENDA, which is the more recent version of this bill, it's not the most recent, the Equality Act is the most recent version, has come up in every Congress save one in 1996, since 1994. So it's come up and has been debated. Sometimes it's made it out of committee, sometimes it's received actual floor votes, sometimes it has not. Basically, it says you can't discriminate against queer and trans people in employment. The fight in 2007 over this bill was, I think, a watershed moment for the trans community. The director of the Human Rights Campaign, the HRC, they're the ones who have the blue background with the yellow equal sticker that you see on bumper stickers all over the place. The president of HRC at the time came to the largest trans and cross-dresser conference in the country. Yes, those were one conference back then. In Atlanta, Georgia. It was called Southern Comfort. It still exists. And he went up on the podium and he swore on a stack of Bibles that the Human Rights Campaign and the LGBTQ plus caucus in the House and Senate would never allow a non-discrimination act to come to a vote in Congress that did not include trans people. Within 3 weeks, Barney Frank, who was out gay congressman from Massachusetts, and the Human Rights Campaign and the caucus had advanced a bill that cut trans people out of that Equality Act and brought that to a vote, saying we can get this to pass the House and the Senate if we metaphorically throw trans people under the bus. It failed to pass both houses of Congress. And more significantly, I think it failed as a maneuver. It absolutely tore the LGBTQ plus community apart. And it really was the last time, I think, that on a national level, the gay, lesbian, and bi community that is not trans ever really tried to push a major piece of legislation that did not include trans people, or a major strategy that did not include trans people. The civil war over that really tore all of the queer and trans orgs apart in a very deep way. And those who had backed a trans exclusive equality bill really found themselves in a tiny minority in the community. And that has been, the echoes of that have come through the community ever since. And it's created an ethic in the community that we don't leave people behind when we fight for equal rights. I won't say that that's always been observed, but it's been something that people can always point to and say, we said in 2007, we'd never do this again. The other time that it came close, it actually passed the Senate by a remarkable margin, getting a fair number of Republican votes. Most of those Republicans have now retired and been replaced by people who I do not expect to be supportive of the bill. But it didn't get out of the House committee back then. Since 2014, it has not seen the light of day in the Senate because the Grim Reaper has presided over the calendar. And I know many of you are probably thinking, what about the Supreme Court case? I saw all of these headlines in the summer with Bostock versus Clayton County. And it's true that that actually solves most of the problems that ENDA intended to address. It prohibits discrimination in employment on the basis of sex, and that includes queer and trans people. So 3 cheers for Bostock versus Clayton County. However, it only covers employment. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later because the language in Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which is what this was a ruling on, shows up in many other federal bills. So there's lots of reason to think that this is going to propagate throughout much of the federal government, but there are lots of places that this actually won't cover. And I think we need to be thinking about how to seal all of those cracks because they're very significant. Some things about this Supreme Court ruling. It is not affirming of trans identity. The lawyers on both sides asked the Supreme Court to not consider the question of whether trans women are women, or trans men are men, or whether non-binary people are non-binary. They asked them to decide whether or not firing someone for being trans was discrimination on the basis of sex, regardless of whether you thought a trans woman was a woman or a man. And it was on that basis that the Supreme Court ruled 6-3. And so there are all sorts of places where in the way that we talk about trans equality, you would think that this would necessarily translate. Access to restrooms, for example, to take something that I'll talk about later that's been a hot button issue in our politics, where it's not at all clear that this is going to translate. Our federal laws do not have a public accommodation requirement with regards to sex. It is actually perfectly legal in some regards to bar women from access to some spaces. And there are some pretty clear broad exceptions to the Bostock ruling that were specifically named by the justices. They said, we are not ruling on the following things. And the list is pretty significant. So it really does suggest that we've got a lot of work ahead of us. The Supreme Court ruling was an incredible relief, but it leaves a lot of holes that we're going to need to address. So because gay marriage was so successful as a wedge issue in 2004, this really affected the way the trans community approached the 2016 election. And so I want to tell a little bit of that history here, and I want to move through it fairly quickly, because I want to leave lots of time for conversation. But just to set the stage, during the Clinton administration, the Hawaii Supreme Court mandated that Hawaii could not actually bar same-sex marriage unless there was a compelling reason to do so. And so Hawaii promptly passed an amendment to their state constitution, which created that compelling reason, so that same-sex marriage did not become legal in Hawaii. And in the political firestorm that followed, with Clinton heading for re-election, he signed the Defense of Marriage Act, which said that the federal government and other states were not bound to respect same-sex marriage rights, even if same-sex marriage became legal elsewhere. Hawaii also led the charge in developing something that was kind of marriage-like, this idea of domestic partnerships that would have some or all, depending on the state you're talking about, of the rights of marriage, but would not have that name and would be, in a way, a sort of a second-class existence. In 2003, we're now moving into the first Bush administration. The Massachusetts Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage, full stop. And unlike some other places where same-sex marriage became legal for a short period of time, this one stuck from 2003 to the present day. Also in 2003, the Supreme Court made its first pro-LGBT ruling since Romer v. Evans in 1997. And it was a really important one because it said that laws that outlawed same-sex sex were fundamentally unconstitutional. And in this atmosphere, George W. Bush, coming up for re-election, comes out in favor of a constitutional amendment to ban same-sex marriage. And he makes it clear that this is going to be a push in his presidential campaign. The way conservative activists talk about the 2004 election, and I am not convinced they are correct, but the way many of them speak of this, they believe in their heart of hearts that this actually swung some critical states for them, that this drove people to the polls who either were not in favor of George Bush's war in Iraq, or who had grown sour on his first administration, but saw same-sex marriage as a real threat. And so it brought them out to the polls. That was a lesson for conservative activists who really cared about anti-LGBT stances and how they would think about trans people as they move forward. So during the first Obama administration and during the second Bush administration, remarkably little happens on this front. A lot is happening in terms of public opinion, but only one other state legalizes same-sex marriage during this period. There is a brief period when same-sex marriages are carried out in California. This comes to the ballot 29 consecutive times, actually 30 consecutive times at the state level, and it fails every time. The voters, every time it is put to them, are not in favor of same-sex marriage during this period. Then in California, the state Supreme Court overturns same-sex marriage, making it, or overturns the ban on same-sex marriage, making it legal. And we voted in Prop 8 to ban same-sex marriage in California. And this was really devastating for the queer community in California, because we thought that this was where the tide was going to turn. This was liberal California. Los Angeles County voted in favor of banning same-sex marriage, which we typically think of as one of the more progressive counties in the state. We had quite vocal proponents of the proposition here in Claremont, among the faculty and among local businesses. There are still local businesses that some of us will not frequent because of their participation in Prop 8. And so that was on the same night that Barack Obama was elected. And I think the lesson, as I've said before, is that the conservative community really took from this is that these anti-LGBTQ plus policies were a winning issue. And that even if this wasn't something that you had a passion about, it was clearly a voter getter And so you should support these efforts if you were a political conservative. It was going to help you get elected. During that first Obama administration, a few more states do legalize same-sex marriage. And Obama himself ran on opposing same-sex marriage, but said that he would support a repeal of the Defense of Marriage Act so that the federal government would recognize same-sex marriages in places where those were legal. And by 3/4 of the way through his term, his attorney general was actually arguing that they should not support this in court. And so when this case went to court, to the Supreme Court, they said they were not going to argue on behalf of DOMA, which was quite a step. Then during the 2012 re-election campaign, I think much to President Obama's chagrin, then Vice President Biden, who famously does not have a filter, was on one of the Sunday news shows, and when asked about it, said, yeah, I'm in favor of same-sex marriage, which started a couple of weeks of frantic reporting. And by the end of that time, Obama had come out in favor of same-sex marriage before the election. And it was clear that after the election, both Prop 8 from California and DOMA were heading to the Supreme Court. And for the first time in that 2012 election, same-sex marriage won at the ballot box in several states. The tide really was clearly turning. As a trans and queer person who had just come out, or just started coming out, I would say, it was really clear to me that history was on our side on this particular issue. And during the second Obama administration, as you probably know, because you all lived through it, this wave really became a tsunami. As you know, the Supreme Court overturned Prop 8, overturned DOMA. Same-sex marriage really swept the country with remarkable speed. And these came really from all sorts of different places. Unlike previously where almost all of the change had happened at places that were really distant from the voters, typically Supreme Courts or state legislatures, very often this was coming with direct voter pressure, which was really quite different. But for me as a trans person living through this period, what was really striking was how quickly the anti-LGBT movements on the right pivoted from being anti-same-sex marriage to targeting trans people. It was almost overnight amnesia. They almost completely forgot that they had ever opposed same-sex marriage. They had always been in favor of same-sex marriage and equality, because who doesn't love equality? And some of my best friends are gay people. But the fire was turned on trans people with lightning speed. And for me, the real lesson of this is that we in the binary trans community, as a trans woman, that trans women and trans men, we have to be very, very careful, because as soon as we clear any sort of a hurdle, those same forces will be turned on the non-binary community. And so we have to be there for the non-binary community in the same way that I think the LGBT community has been there for us. And when I say LGBT, I mean the cis LGBT part of the community, because an awful lot of trans people are also lesbian, gay, and bi. So 2013, this is before same-sex marriage is even legal throughout the country, was when I got involved in this activism, and I'm going to leave that for another talk. I've talked about that elsewhere. But we had a lot of really positive changes, particularly for trans kids in California. And as a result of that, we had a drive to get something put on the ballot that would revoke a law that was passed by the California Assembly and Senate that would recognize trans kids in K-12 public schools. And so this was the first campaign that I ever worked on. And they were really very explicit about the scare tactics that they were going to use in this campaign. And they used them absolutely ruthlessly. It was all about trans women in women's and girls' bathrooms. It was very, very targeted at bathrooms, and very often portraying trans women who appeared extremely masculine, threatening, in particular, young girls. So I want to back up for a moment and talk about Title IX and how this is related to Title VII and all of that, because one of the things that was coming down through the schools at this time, in addition to this bill that we were fighting against, was the Obama administration was really pushing to have trans kids recognized and protected in schools under Title IX. So Title VII, which is the one that was ruled on in Bostock, says that you cannot discriminate in employment on the basis of sex. Title IX, which is part of the educational amendments of 1972, essentially copy pastes that language, not exactly, but essentially copy pastes that language into education. And there's a whole bunch of other federal laws that essentially copy paste that language into other places. So the way to think about this, I think, is that there was a Supreme Court ruling in the late 80s that said that discrimination against stereotypes is also sex discrimination. So if you're discriminating against a woman because she's not doing woman right, you are engaging in sex discrimination. They also ruled that harassment on the basis of sex is discrimination on the basis of sex. So if you were harassing trans kids in school because they are not doing boy right or not doing girl right, you are also violating Title IX. So it was really on this basis that the Obama administration really started going after school districts that were not being supportive of trans kids in schools. And they very strategically started doing this in California, where there were also laws in the books where this was happening. But then this really exploded and really went national. The EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, starts making all sorts of rulings around the country that have implications for schools, and schools are where a lot of these fights break out. The Obama administration published a Dear Colleague letter, which is essentially the government putting schools on notice that you need to interpret the law in the following ways. And those Dear Colleague letters effectively have something like the force of law, because it's been ruled by the Supreme Court that, in effect, the executive branch gets to interpret the law, except in places where the court has ruled otherwise. So where the text of a law is not entirely ambiguous, the executive branch gets to say what that law means, unless a court rules that they think that the language of the law is unambiguous. And the place where this really came to a head was over the case of Gavin Grimm, who was a student in Gloucester County in Northern Virginia. His school district would not let him use the boys' bathroom. And ultimately his suit ends up going all the way up to the Supreme Court, all the way back down to the lower level, and is heading back up to the Supreme Court again. I'm trying to rush through this history here because I want to get to the good part, which is the end, which is the present day. 2015, I think, was a really scary moment for all of us in the trans community who are watching these bathroom bills being rolled out, because Houston passed an equal rights ordinance that included trans people in their non-discrimination laws. It was not a bathroom-focused bill. It was non-discrimination across the board, but of course it included public accommodations and bathrooms with that. And there was a national fight that came to Houston to try to overturn this equal rights amendment. The Houston Equal Rights Amendment was called HERO. And the community really tried to push for people on the left to, or people who were sympathetic with LGBTQ plus causes, to really come to the defense of the queer and trans community in Houston. And by and large, they did not answer the call. Probably the most notable of these was the attempt to get Beyonce to come back to Houston and fight on behalf of HERO, which she remained silent on. She's since been quite vocal on LGBTQ plus causes, but in that fight, there was a lot of bitterness about the fact that she remained completely silent about it. The picture on the right here is a pretty horrific TV ad that aired around Houston of a man going into a bathroom after a little girl and breaking into her stall. These were the tactics that were used, and we lost this fight. The Equal Rights Ordinance in Houston was overturned, and the anti-LGBTQ plus activists around the country were absolutely explicit that this was a dry run for the 2016 presidential election, that they wanted to use these kinds of bills in swing states as a way of driving out voters and driving up antipathy toward queer and trans people at the ballot box, and driving out the vote. And they wanted to show that it could be done in Houston because Houston was a blue city. And if they could pull it off in Houston, then they could pull it off in these swing states. North Carolina on cue passes HB 2, which is House Bill 2, which was an anti-trans bathroom bill throughout the state. And at the same time, Gavin Grimm's case is going up to the Supreme Court. He wins in the Fourth Circuit, which includes North Carolina, where they rule on the basis of the Obama administration's interpretation of the law that he should be able to use the boys' bathroom. This is about when a vacancy appears on the Supreme Court, and it seems clear that the next administration is probably going to appoint the people who are going to rule on this case. And while candidate Trump did not weigh in on HB 2, Governor Pat McCrory in North Carolina went all in and made this really the center point of his re-election campaign. By spring 2016, the Obama administration had essentially pulled all of the levers you can pull in the federal government to say that anywhere where it says on the basis of sex, trans and non-binary people are included. And in May, they sued North Carolina over this bathroom bill, over HB 2. And the two people that you see in this picture are Loretta Lynch, who was the Attorney General for President Barack Obama, and Vanita Gupta, who was the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights in the Department of Justice. She has been nominated by Joe Biden to be the Assistant Attorney General in this new administration. And she is the one who actually carried out this lawsuit against North Carolina, which became moot because Hillary Clinton lost the election before it could come to court. So in 2016, this was also a really scary time, not only because Trump had become president, but because so much of the hue and cry on the left was about how trans people were to blame for this, that identity politics were to blame. And the example of identity politics that always seemed to leap to people's mouths was transgender bathrooms and pronouns. And the fact that you had a squintillion different options for your gender on Facebook. However, at the ballot box, that seems to have not been the case. As a wedge issue, it failed. In North Carolina, the place where they really tried to use this to juice turnout, the governor lost his re-election bid. And it was really clear that HB 2 was not popular at the polls. It was subsequently overturned in North Carolina. Mostly. It has still not been completely repealed. But yeah, it seems to have failed as a wedge issue, but it remains very active on the right. However, Trump remarkably mostly just issued executive orders over his 4 years that undid executive orders from President Obama. Almost essentially nothing passed into legislation. Almost nothing even passed into federal rules. Almost all of it was just guidance that was handed down or dear colleague letters. They did, however, try to put a lot of religious exemptions everywhere they could. And they really made a deliberate effort to be cruel where they could and to really signal that trans and non-binary people were second-class citizens in every way that they could. Meanwhile, I think something really remarkable happened, and it didn't just happen on queer and trans rights, but it did happen on queer and trans rights. And it happened, I think, throughout our politics, which is on social issues, the two parties dramatically polarized. And that is on the left, you saw both the entire Democratic Party and essentially the independents of the United States who sit in the middle between Republicans and Democrats. I'm not talking about the independents who are to the left and the right of the major parties. But you really saw a congealing behind trans and non-binary issues during this period. However, on the other side of the spectrum, you really saw this gaining a lot of traction in activist spaces on the right, and also in some of these violent and anti-democratic groups on the right. So this remains a very live issue for activists in those corners, but it doesn't seem to be a big electoral issue at this point. One thing that really did happen over the last 4 years was we have been really successful in pushing for non-binary identification. We now have options for a third gender option on IDs in 19 states where the options are male, female, and non-binary. This has happened remarkably quickly over the last 4 years, despite federal opposition. It's still not possible on federal ID. The level of comfort with they, them pronouns and the number of people in America who say they personally know someone who is non-binary or who uses they, them pronouns has absolutely exploded in the last 4 years. So it has not been 4 years of complete stasis. It's just that that movement has really happened at the state and local level. I've spent all of this time talking about the past, a couple of slides on the present, and then I want to have a conversation. But unless we get rid of the filibuster, which really requires 60 votes to close debate and take a vote in the Senate, with 50 Democratic senators and 4 maybe trans-supportive senators in the Republican Party, 54 is less than 60. I'm good enough at math that I can count, and I don't see us passing legislation. Unless something dramatically changes. And I don't think that's going to happen. Obviously, Biden can pass as many or can write as many executive orders as he wants. And he's written a lot of those already. And they've largely undone the executive orders of the trans administration. Unfortunately, that low-hanging fruit is coming probably toward its end. There will be more things that come up. And we definitely need to push when that happens. I really don't think that's going to be the hard part. Honestly, I think getting Biden to sign executive orders that protect trans people is going to be pretty easy. And that's because of who he is and the people that he's been close to. I think one of the reasons that we dodged a bullet over the last 4 years was that this was a remarkably lazy presidency. And they got almost nothing done on this issue, in part because it was not one of the few things that the president cared about. That is, however, not at all true of Biden. He's talked about trans issues as the civil rights issue of our time. He has issued no commentary that I've heard that suggests that he's less sympathetic to non-binary rights. And if you look at who he has been around and who he is nominating, this fills me with a tremendous amount of hope going forward. On the right is Senator Sarah Mcbride, who was a campaign worker for his son, Beau Biden, and she is a trans woman who was just elected to the state Senate of Delaware, and she is now the highest ranking trans lawmaker in the United States and in history. So she is very close to the Biden family personally. And the Bidens were very instrumental in getting a trans equality law passed in Delaware, where she is a state senator. Biden, as a result, I think, has been close to a lot of people in the trans community who are active in Washington. When Danica Roem, who was the first trans legislator to be elected to a state level office, was elected in 2017, she was watching election returns and not wanting to be confident that she had won and waiting for one more precinct and not wanting to make a victory speech. And she received a call from former Vice President Biden congratulating her on her victory. And there's this iconic photo of her on her knees on the floor of the campaign headquarters, just her face buried in her hands after she gets off that phone call, because that was the moment where it really sunk in. Vanita Gupta, who led the lawsuit against North Carolina over HB2, is being named to the #2 spot in the Department of Justice. And other people that he has assigned to the civil rights arm of the Department of Justice really make me think that they are going to push hard on trans non-binary rights everywhere they can. So I want to close with a couple of quick lists of things that I think that we should be pushing for in the next 4 years. Obviously, non-binary federal IDs. Make that transparent and easy and straightforward so that anybody can get an X on their ID anywhere they need to. This is incredibly important for non-binary people who are in red states where the state legislatures are not going to push for this. I think we need to push for a hard line on intersex surgery. I have not talked about the intersex community because I am not intersex, but intersex people are born with sex characteristics that we normally would assign, with sex characteristics that differ from what we would normally assign to male or female. They may have genitalia that appear otherwise than we would normally associate with men and women, for example, and very often they are subjected to non-consensual surgery as infants. And this is something that the intersex community has been fighting hard against for many, many years. And I think the Biden administration and the federal government have a role to set the tone and to state in unambiguous terms that this is not considered good practice, that is considered barbaric, and we should stop performing non-consensual surgeries on infants and small children. Obviously, we need to robustly implement non-discrimination on the basis of sex throughout everywhere where there's federal language in the laws. That I think will happen. I don't think that will take much pushing. One thing that the Trump administration did do was get a bunch of attempts to start counting queer and trans people off the books. And so I think the Biden administration needs to do that. We need to collect data on the queer and trans community so that we know what our needs are and we can document places where there are shortfalls. And I think that we need to make a hard push on religious exemptions. We've really allowed this to become an exception to civil rights and equality laws, and that's very dangerous. And I want to close by pointing out that now we're reaching the point where queer and trans people have enough representation in Congress, and we have enough political power, and we have achieved equality on some of the big ticket issues that we have no excuse for not really fighting in an intersectional way and adding our voice as a caucus, start acting like a caucus in solidarity with other groups who are pushing for social justice issues that absolutely do affect the trans and non-binary community, but are not exclusive to the trans and non-binary community. We absolutely have to be a part of the fight for policing and carceral reform. This absolutely is a part of equality for trans and non-binary people who are over-policed, over-incarcerated, and who suffer from that system along with everyone else who is engaged in that system, but suffer in some very particular ways. We need to be actively engaged in pushes on work to end poverty in America, to raise the minimum wage, to create protection for gig workers, because trans people are disproportionately present in these sectors of our economy and of our job force. We need to be pushing for the decriminalization and the destigmatization of sex work. A remarkable number of trans and non-binary people do survival sex work, and it is a job. And the way that they are targeted and imprisoned and stigmatized for it leads to a tremendous amount of harm, particularly to trans women of color and non-binary people of color. The federal government does not regulate social media. But what the federal government says about social media platforms' attempts to enforce their own terms of service and remove hate speech from their platforms actually matters quite a lot. And so the federal government can play a role in setting the tone, in saying that just like all other hate speech, transphobic hate speech really has no place on the platforms of these large scale companies. And we need to be very serious about how we handle anti-democratic and violent hate groups in this country. They have received a 4-year pass. And while I am very leery of new laws and the use of laws that have traditionally been used to go after terrorists, which have disproportionately targeted people of color, have disproportionately targeted Muslims, have disproportionately targeted immigrant communities. I do think that we need to be very careful about the rise of far-right and anti-democratic and violent hate groups. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and would love to hear any of your thoughts or any questions that you might have.
Yeah, I have a question. Can you hear me okay? Thank you. Thank you for that presentation. That
I
was
can hear you just great. I just muted
okay.
myself, however.
Okay. Thank you for the presentation. It was incredibly insightful. I really appreciate what you shared with us. One of the things that we're doing at the company that I work for is we're trying to understand, we're at the very beginning stages of understanding how we can work to identify our trans population so that we start the process of becoming a more equity-based company. Do you have any additional, you mentioned that in the bullet point there. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And if you have any suggestions, either resources or how people can go about doing that in a manner that is respectful and but still gets to your point of being able to provide an identity for that population.
Right. So I will start by putting my email in the chat because this is probably a longer conversation and I'd love to chat with you.
Thank you.
But one thing that I will say that I think would, and by the way, any and all of you are absolutely free to contact me. I'd love to strike up a conversation with any of you. But one thing that I will say is that very often when people try to do this, they end up creating demographic forms that ask about trans and non-binary identity in ways that don't feel great. The classic example is man, woman, transgender, right? That first of all says either I'm a woman or I'm trans, and clearly not both. So the first thing that I would say is when asking for gender on any form, say male, female, non-binary.
Okay. Decline
to state. And the other is to make questions about trans or non-binary status a separate question. Are you cisgender? Are you transgender? Are you non-binary? Do you decline to state? All that apply. But yeah, I'd love to have a longer conversation about that. But if I were to give a 5-cent answer, that's my nickel answer.
Thank you.
Really?
Okay,
Nobody?
I do have more. I don't want to hog the floor, but I have another question.
Yeah, fire away.
Just in terms of, do you have any, as a parent, do you have any thoughts, comments on how parents can support their children who might be going through a questioning period and process? Trying to understand.
I would say, first of all, do as much of your own research as you can. And I would recommend GLAAD as a good place to start for that. And also PFLAG. Are you familiar with PFLAG?
Yes, I'm a member.
Okay, fantastic. PFLAG used to be an acronym that stood for Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, but obviously to be more inclusive, if they still wanted it to be an acronym, it would have to get very long. So now PFLAG just stands for PFLAG. But I remember my introduction to PFLAG was an activist who I was doing work with around this bill protecting trans kids, was also a big member of PFLAG because she has a non-binary kid. And they were really short on people to march with the PFLAG banner at Long Beach Pride one year. And so she asked if I could show up and help represent. I said, of course, I'd be happy to march Pride. And I did, and I was just overwhelmed by the number of people of all ages who came up to the contingent and just gave people hugs and who were in tears and said, thank you to PFLAG because it transformed my family and my experience with my family. So I think highly of the organization, but obviously it's very dependent on the people in any circle that gather together to do that work. So I would say educating yourself is the first thing. I'd say the second thing is just be open to change and to the sense that it's totally okay for what that identity looks like to shift over time. And that it might be, I think I'm trans one day and binary, and it might be I'm not binary the next day, and it might be, no, I'm cisgender and I'm queer the next. And that's part of that questioning process. And I think we're really conditioned to believe that we have to have all of the answers as queer and trans people at the moment we come out to our loved ones. And the more that our loved ones really signal that, you know, wherever this journey takes us, I'm there with you. And I guess the last thing that I would say is don't overdo apologies. It's really easy to castigate yourself for doing something wrong. It's enough to correct a mistake and to say I'm sorry and to move on. Because when it turns into a giant mea culpa, you're essentially asking the trans or the non-binary person to absolve you and say, it's okay that you screwed up, rather than just saying, I screwed up, I'm gonna do better, I'm sorry. That doesn't ask anything back from the trans or non-binary person. It doesn't ask them to say they're okay when they're still smarting a little bit from the wrong pronoun or the wrong name. Or those would be my quick tips. Got a question in the chat. Do you have any sense for how the Biden administration might impact LGBTQI trans-related work in US embassies around the globe? I have a strong sense that Biden really thinks that it is important for the US president to say things when things happen. And I think that he will probably institute policies in the embassies that are consonant with what's being done in the US federal government. How much they will push on the ground in Uganda and in other places, I really don't know. I don't have nearly as strong a sense for how much they will attempt to navigate the internal politics of Uganda or of any other nation state. But I do know that Biden, throughout his Senate career, has been really big on making a public pronouncement and saying that X is wrong. Talk's cheap. How much that necessarily helps people who are fighting for LGBTQIA plus equality in places around the world, I don't know. But I feel confident about that, and I feel less confident outside the embassy walls. But since you asked specifically about the embassy, my gut, which is not my head, and you know we've all learned not to trust our guts, they can lead you to bad places, is that within the embassy, you'll see something that's pretty consonant with federal policy.
Well, we have reached the 5 o'clock hour, and people are welcome to stay on if Professor Williams is willing to, but there's also another session that starts, I think, at 5, our inaugural True Equity session. So people might be interested in going to that. But Professor Williams, I'll let you decide if you want to stay on, if there's more questions. I saw a little note come up that you're the host now. So I think
Excellent.
we all go away. So
you can run away. You can go to your next gig.
And I just want to
understand what that's like.
Coming. This was so enlightening, very interesting. And thank you so much for your presentation, Professor.
Yeah, absolutely. And Nancy, please.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Nancy.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to stay a little while if folks have any other questions or comments or thoughts of your own. I'm hardly an expert. I've just been living this life.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Hello, Claire.
Hello.
I'll say
Oh,
thank you
my
too.
mom is here.
Hey there. Good to see you both.
Me Great to hear so much information firsthand, and also the history.
Yeah, I think it can provide important context.
I'm sorry, I'm eating dinner.
All right, thank you.
No, totally fine. All right. Thank you so much, Brenda.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.